NBA Cares at nbacares.org. At the end of this presentation, there will be a question and answer session. Throughout the webinar, we invite you to use the live chat feature by clicking on the icon at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions. If you are participating by phone, you may email your questions to mkilpatrick, that's MKILPATRICK, at nbacares.org. After the presentation, we will address as many questions as possible. If your question is not answered here, we will follow up with you via email. Again, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available for future use. So at this time, I will turn the conversation over to Dean to introduce our topic and our presenters.
My name is Reverend Dean Bucalis. I'm the Mission Specialist for National Benevolent Association Prison and Jail Ministries. This webinar is the third in a series focused on congregational and general church involvement in prison and jail advocacy and ministry. Our co-sponsors of this webinar are the Disciples Center for Public Witness, the Disciples Justice Action Network, and Reconciliation Ministry. And we are delighted to have those of you who have come to participate in this webinar. Our topic this evening is one that is in response to the adoption of Resolution 1525 by the 2015 Christian Church Disciples of Christ General Assembly, which calls the church to engage in reflection, prayer, and education, and possible action around the practice of solitary confinement of incarcerated youth and adults. We're pleased and blessed to welcome two of the nation's premier experts on this particular topic to lead us this evening. I want to introduce Reverend Laura Markle-Downton, who is the Director of U.S. Prisons Policy and Program at the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, which is an interfaith membership organization working to end torture in U.S. policy, practice, and culture. Comprised of over 300 religious organizations, the campaign membership includes representatives from the Catholic, Evangelical Christian, Mainline Protestant, Unitarian Universalist, Quaker, Orthodox Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Baha'i, Buddhist, and Sikh communities. Reverend Downton directs the state and federal advocacy agenda for interfaith leadership and National Religious Campaign Against Torture's campaign to end torture in the United States prisons and jails, with a focus on ending long-term solitary confinement. She provides coordination, training, resource development, and technical direction to faith-based organizations nationally. Most recently, she's developed programmatic tools for faith community outreach, including supervising the production of a documentary about solitary confinement called Breaking Down the Box, and coordinated a nationwide tour of a solitary confinement prison cell replica. Her ministry is focused on cultivating and increasing national and local collaborative partnerships with directly impacted communities, religious leadership, and other key allies in interfaith and human rights coalitions to advance the campaign's human rights advocacy goals. She coordinates correspondence with members of Congress and representatives of federal, state, and local government entities to carry out the campaign's human rights policy agenda, supervises its seminarian organizing program in key states, and produces advocacy materials including toolkits, worship resources, model legislation, policy one-pagers, talking points, membership action alerts, and website content. You can see why we invited her to be here, and actually she has absolutely no spare time apparently. We are fortunate to have her join us. I also want to introduce Johnny Perez, who is a non-attorney mental health advocate for the Urban Justice Center's Mental Health Project, a law firm providing pro bono legal representation to underserved populations affected by social justice issues. When he's not advocating on behalf of New York's most vulnerable populations, Mr. Perez works to change the status quo of unjust policies and practices as a member of pro-social groups, including the Jails Action Coalition, the Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement, and the New York Reentry Education Network. Johnny is also a member of the Bar Association's Correction and Reentry Committee. Drawing on the wisdom of 13 years of direct involvement with the criminal justice system, Johnny has testified at the New York Advisory Committee to the United States Civil Rights Commission about inhumane treatment of teenagers in solitary confinement in state prisons and city jails. He is a sought-after speaker, having been invited to speak at Cornell Law School, Fordham University, Amnesty International, Princeton University, and at the American Justice Summit, where he discussed the cycle of incarceration with Nightline News anchor Juju Chang. In addition to recently becoming a 2015 Opportunity Agenda Fellow, Johnny will be speaking at the upcoming Amnesty International Conference in Boston on November the 7th. Johnny expects to complete his bachelor's degree in criminal justice at St. Francis College, while also completing his first nonfiction book with the working title, Prison, the Upside Down Kingdom. As you can tell, we're also delighted to have Johnny join us. They both have very, very busy schedules, and we feel very privileged to have them join us this evening. It's our hope that at the end of this webinar, those participating will not only have a greater awareness of this critical human rights issue, but will also have a toolbox of resources to continue this conversation and advocacy in your home church and community. As Monica mentioned, at the end of their presentations, we'll have a time for questions. You may type those in and we'll share them with Laura and Johnny. So Laura, let's begin with you.
Great. Well, Dean, thank you for that very generous introduction. It really is a gift to be with you all, and we are so excited about the commitment that the disciples of Christ have made to this human rights issue that really begs our attention and begs our action as people of faith. So we celebrate that you've made this commitment, and we're looking forward to working with you as we stand together to work to end torture in our prisons. So tonight, we want to focus on some of the ways that the courageous action of those most affected by solitary confinement are leading to seismic changes in public discourse, in federal and state policy, where we are seeing an embrace of international human rights norms, and in grassroots activism and community involvement. So on any given day in US prisons, an estimated 80 to 100,000 people, disproportionately people of color, are held in solitary confinement. That number does not tell us their names nor their stories. It does not tell us the names of their family members who are most impacted by the anguish of this separation. It doesn't tell us the stories of the staff who work in segregated and restricted housing units where mental deterioration, self-mutilation, and suicide are commonplace. But those with firsthand experience of solitary confinement in their loved ones have indeed awakened the conscience of our nation and are awakening state legislatures and even the White House to the moral crisis of solitary confinement. To make sense of solitary confinement and the prevalence of torture in our prisons, we have to look back. We have to step back and see that over 4 decades of get tough on crime, punishment paradigms have led us to this point. We have to look deeply at the ways in which our mental health system has literally shifted to our prisons and jails, and look to the ways in which mandatory minimum sentencing, racial profiling and policing, 3 strikes laws, and policy decisions that have been made over the last 40 years have had dramatic impact with dramatic disproportionate effect on communities of color because of a series of policy decisions. So as we look at and talk about solitary confinement, the first step is really for us just to look at what is solitary. And so I'm wondering, Johnny, if you could break that down for us. So when we use the term solitary confinement, what are we really talking about?
Yeah, so thank you for having me, Blow. That's a very good question. And when we think about solitary, I guess if no one knows anything about solitary, one of the things that they need to understand is that it's a box inside of a box. And what I mean by that is that you're already in prison, except that is used as a punitive measure for people that are, quote unquote, may or may not be following the rules, and is used very arbitrarily. So what it is that people are taken away from the general population and placed in these segregated housing units where they are placed in a cell all by themselves for 23 hours a day. And in some cases, like in the case of Rikers Island, in practice, it actually works where a person is stays there for 24 hours a day because of the time of the day in which they will be staying is at in the morning. And a lot of men and women find it hard to wake up that early in order to go and take advantage of the recreation. Um, the cell is very small, very quiet. I've been in cells personally where if I stretch both of my hands out to both my sides, I can touch both walls at the same time. There's a toilet right inside the cell, and the officer brings your food to you while you're inside the cell. You don't come out to eat, you don't come out for rooms, anything like that. Everything is literally brought to you. There's absolutely very minimal human contact, and if a person receives visits, they'll be able to go and visit the person with the limitations. In some prisons, you cannot have any type of contact with your visitor, and others you can. Um, and it has long-term psychological ramifications, which we hope we'll get into later. But the short answer is that it's been a source of punishment inside of a prison that is disproportionately affecting a large number of people who are, what 80,000 people right now are currently in solitary, and it's something that people walk out of there that they really don't come out the same after they're in there.
Absolutely. So one of the guiding principles that we take and follow in our work is looking to the standard and recommendations put forth by the United Nations, and particularly the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, who in his 2011 report called for a prohibition against the use of solitary confinement beyond 15 days in all circumstances, because after that point, permanent damage is done to any human person that's subjected to this form of isolation. In addition, in his report, he called for a ban, an outright ban on the placement of the most vulnerable in solitary confinement conditions. So that would include youth, our young people, pregnant women, individuals who enter the prison or jail or detention center with a mental illness. When we look at the reality of the way that solitary confinement is used in our prisons and jails and detention centers throughout the country, we have a long road to walk to get to that standard. The average length of stay in solitary confinement in a state like California is estimated at 6.7 years. In a state like Texas, almost 4 years on average. And so when we consider the level of damage and harm that's done to an individual, any individual who's placed in these conditions, we, from a moral perspective, are calling and working together for an end to the use of this practice and a ban on its use for those who are most vulnerable. One of the areas that is often or at times overlooked in this work and in this conversation, but a piece that's critically important for the faith community to lift up is the impact of this practice and the toxic environments it creates, not only on the individuals who are enduring it and their loved ones who are suffering on the outside, but also staff. What we have seen is that cycles of incidents of PTSD and trauma leading to suicide, such incidents are incredibly high among staff who are working in these environments. And so one of the things that we want to lift up from the faith community's perspective is one of restorative justice, one that says we need to work for work for disruption of cycles of trauma, and that to be subjecting anyone to conditions that only further exacerbate a trauma cycle and cycles of violence are not a solution. But we all have a stake, a moral stake, in the condition to which those who are in our prisons are returned to us. So, Johnny, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of officers who, and I mean, not just officers, but correctional staff, including medical staff and administrative staff, who also, have these vicarious effects of solitary, because they're also working inside the box. And although they're not, isolated like the person inside the cell, having to be exposed to a lot of the trauma that people inside the cell, experience a lot of times. So they also experience it, vicariously. And like you said, it affects everybody, not just the person inside the cell and the person who's keeping that person inside the cell, but also the family members who really don't know what's going on with the person. When you find out and hear about somebody dying inside of solitary, that reverberates, and it does something to people's families where they really don't know if their loved one's going to make it out of the cell. And if they do make it physically out, they're not really unsure. They're unsure if they'll, if they will, the psychological consequences that are so often, we see along with doing time in solitary.
So one of the core goals and core values for our work is that of recognizing that in order for us to end this practice, in order for us to confront mass incarceration and the new Jim Crow and the root drivers of these policies, we have to, as communities of faith, stand with, learn from, and be guided by the real experts, those who have survived this firsthand, because we know that they are indeed the leaders that hold the solution. And so as we look at how our congregations can be engaged in this work, we take that as another leading significant guidepost for us in this work. Just want to share a story from California. As many of you may know, on July 8th of 2013, over 30,000 incarcerated people began their third peaceful hunger strike to protest the inhumane conditions of long-term isolation in California prisons. On the 60th day, the hunger strike was suspended, having garnered national and international media attention. As a result of the historic hunger strikes, two California legislators committed to host a series of hearings stating the issues raised by the hunger strike are real. Concerns about the use of conditions of solitary confinement in California prisons and will not be ignored. They went on to say, those participating in the hunger strike have succeeded in bringing these issues to the center of public awareness and debate. And legislators now recognize the seriousness and urgency of these concerns, and we will move forward to address them. Indeed, a series of legislative hearings did take place in late 2013 and in early 2014. And the legislative struggle continues in California. We'll speak to that further a little later on. But just weeks ago, bolstered by the prisoner-led hunger strikes and subsequent organizing by families and survivors of solitary on the outside, a historic settlement was reached in the Ashker versus Brown class action lawsuit, which has resulted in a few significant changes in California prisons, though much additional work and change is needed. It's important to know that the plaintiffs in the lawsuit, who are 10 incarcerated people who have been isolated in the Pelican Bay SHU or Secure Housing Unit, Solitary Confinement Unit, for periods ranging from 11 to 22 years. And in their case, they challenged the constitutionality of their solitary confinement at the Pelican Bay Public Security Housing Unit. The photo before us is a photo of two leaders from that movement in California, one significant leader on the inside and the other on the outside. Pictured on your left is Satawa, who is one of the representatives of the Pelican Bay Human Rights Short Corridor Collective, one of the leaders of the hunger strikes, and one of the authors of an agreement to end hostilities. This is an agreement that was authored by a number of incarcerated people in the Pelican Bay SHU several years ago, calling for an end to hostilities between racial ethnic groups within the prison. This call for an end to hostilities was a call for peace. It was a peace movement within our prisons. And one of the reasons it's so significant is that in California, the use of a gang validation process has been used there, as well as in other state systems, in which someone could be validated as a gang member for something as simple as having a piece of Aztec art in their cell, reading certain literature, even simply speaking Spanish. And once gang validated as a gang member, the individual would be placed in SHU indefinitely. So this was part of what the hunger strike was to draw attention to. This is part of what literally thousands of individuals within our prisons were literally risking their lives for us to hear them and to draw attention to this injustice. The only way that someone could be removed their gang validation status was to identify someone else as a gang member. So in other words, the only way that someone could be moved out of their torture was to give someone else up to be subjected to it. So this cause has been causing enormous pain, enormous abuse, and enormous injustice. This photo that we see before us of Satawa and Marie is a co-founder of a powerful group in California called California Families Against Solitary Confinement. She and Dolores Canales, a mother whose son has been in the SHU for over 15 years in California, and many other loved ones have been leading the charge in California and nationwide to stand with their loved ones, to get their stories heard. And this image is an image that Marie has shared with us from California. Last week, Marie visited her brother and was able to hug him and hold his hand and break bread with him after 31 years of being denied that access. Since 1982, Marie had not been able to touch or hug her brother, Satawa. I hope that you will hold their faces in your heart and in your prayer as you explore and discern for yourself and for your own community and congregation what it means to get engaged with us in this work. We want to look at the ways in which the faith community has been playing a critical role in this work, and look a bit at the opportunities that are before us to get more engaged. But before we shift there, I want to just stop and see, Johnny, if you have anything that you want to add at this point.
No, as I hear you, explain, talk about that story, that firsthand experience story, it just kind of drives home the point that we're dealing with a system here that kind of feeds on the souls of people. It kind of, it perpetuates and it damages people, and it really serves no social purpose but except to damage people permanently.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's certainly a powerful message in the face of, when we look at how the practice has been justified in public spaces. It's most often justified by claims that this practice is needed for public safety. And Johnny, I'm wondering if you want to take a moment to speak to that.
Well, that's a good question. When I think about public safety, that word is thrown around so much. You know, when it actually increases, it increases the likelihood that someone can actually be victimized by it. A lot of folks don't know that there are a lot of people who are being released directly from solitary into the community. And I've had conversations where people feel like it's not an issue that concerns them because these people are not being released into their community. But anytime that we support or perpetuate or even endorse a system that releases people who are more likely to commit a crime than they are when they went in, then it's an issue that affects everyone. You know, I think in the beginning of the slides, so this is a human issue, not a black or white issue. Although it does affect folks of color disproportionately, it is a human issue because, you know, if you're going to release me into society after doing 5 years of complete isolation and you drop me in the middle of 42nd Street, which is like sensory overload, you know, I've worked with clients who would rather stay inside of jail, would rather go back to prison than to deal with, you know, the consequences of being out in society, having that transition or that time to transition, you know. And unfortunately, I've had committed crimes to go back to that environment because I haven't been, you know, quoted down. So about public safety, not which we're here is we're social, but also the tools in which a person from that kind of societal environment, which right now knowledge in New York State is not at most in solitary into a shelter and to have anxiety. And Einstein said, if you have fish by its ability to climb a tree, single time. So not only are people later a year at a time without contacting them any programs, we expect for them to see after the time solitary.
Absolutely. So I wanted to share briefly just some of the powerful statements and words that we have seen coming from the ecumenical and interfaith community as we stand together to confront this human rights crisis. At the height of the 2013 hunger strikes in California, the California Conference of Catholic Bishops released a powerful statement saying that we stand opposed to this treatment because it is not restorative, and indeed it is torture. And I have a slide that doesn't want to advance. We obviously celebrate the work that the disciples of Christ have done in passing the resolution just this summer calling for reflection and research, and look forward to continuing that work with you throughout the course of your time. We've heard from Pope Francis about this practice, calling solitary confinement in high security prisons a form of torture, and calling torture not just a grave sin, but a sin against humanity. So how do these words translate into action? We want to do a bit of talking about policy change that is moving at the federal level and also at the state level, because there's a great deal of opportunity for us as people of faith to stand up and be engaged in those efforts. The first ever congressional hearing about solitary confinement took place in 2012. It was followed in 2014 by a second congressional hearing. There were over 15 religious organizations that submitted testimony for the record for that hearing. I would commend to your reading and your research after this evening video and testimony that you can find by clicking on the slide on your screen. In 2014, the National Religious Campaign Against Torture submitted a shadow report in preparation for the United Nations Committee Against Torture in connection to its review of the US in compliance with the U.S. Convention Against Torture. Ultimately, our position as people of faith was that the U.S. Continued widespread practice of holding incarcerated people, disproportionately people of color, in prolonged solitary confinement, not only constitutes torture, but it holds us in violation of the Convention Against Torture. Earlier this year, we joined more than 30 religious organizations in delivering a letter to the White House that was endorsed by the Disciples of Christ, calling for the president to ensure that the ongoing Department of Justice nationwide review of solitary confinement include a clear pathway to the elimination of long-term isolation. So we celebrate our partnership in that work, and we'll continue to be making the appeals to our president, to the Department of Justice, and to our legislators to take action. So much of this work and the heart of it is really taking place at the state and local level. We know that a majority of the people who are in our prisons are in state systems. More states passed solitary confinement reforms in the year 2014 than in the past 16 years combined. So what that tells us is that this awakening around the country, that we've got to address this issue, is one that's dramatic and that it's spreading. It is important to note that policy reform proposals are not always synonymous with work to end the practice of long-term isolation. Many of the bills thus far that have been introduced at the state level are an important step, but we would say as people of faith that we need to go much further. Many of the bills that we've been working on would include prohibiting the placement of youth and our young people in conditions of solitary confinement. But ultimately, we are really looking to the state of New York, who's been working a campaign there that's really a model legislation for the nation. And again, we're so thrilled, Johnny, that you are here and as a major leader in that campaign in New York, can speak to the incredible work that's been happening there.
Absolutely. So we have gained a lot of momentum, and actually we just finished having a retreat a statewide retreat where we kind of re-coordinated our efforts. But I'm glad to announce that we have about 29 co-sponsors in the Assembly and 13 co-sponsors in the Senate. And their legislators co-signing or signing on almost every month. We have different chapters throughout the entire state, and people are just mobilizing. It's ordinary people who live next door who say, you know what, I'm tired. I do not want to support this, state-sanctioned torture in a sense, and they're calling the legislators and saying, we're not going to vote for you if you don't co-sign on to this legislation. The legislation in question, which you have here on your slide, is the HALT Act, the Humane Alternatives for Long-Term Solitary Confinement. And we say alternatives because we realize that there might be some times in spaces where people do need to be separated from the population, but that doesn't mean that we need to treat them inhumanely in order to hold them accountable. So it limits solitary in a number of different ways, including the number of days that people are spent inside, in these isolated units to bring us in line with the UN Repertoire on Torture to 15 days, and no more than 20 days no more than 20 consecutive days in a 60-day period. And this is important because as we speak, there's people in solitary, as you not only mentioned in your earlier story, but in New York State, there's people spending decades in solitary. And what folks don't know is that any misbehavior report that you receive while in solitary only leads to more solitary time, even if that misbehavior report didn't initially lead you to being placed in solitary while you were in general population. So what that looks like is that someone can receive, let's say, 90 days for testing positive for marijuana. They end up there for 5, 6, 7 years for only subsequent misbehavior reports they received while they ripped up their sheet because they wanted to dry themselves, didn't have any clean laundry, or they used their towels to mop their cells because the mop only comes around once a week. People receiving misbehavior reports for these are spending days and years at a time. So we've reached out to a lot of different communities. We always try to find out creative ways in which we can not only raise awareness about solitary, but also educate the public about solitary. And what we found throughout our work is that a lot of people, many people, once they find out exactly the conditions of solitary and that it's happening right there in their backyard and that their tax dollars are paying for it, they really put their foot down about it. And I've seen a lot of people get, emotional about this going on, and they really don't know. So part of our campaign has been raising awareness, educating people, and then giving people the tools in which they can mobilize in their own communities if there's not any mobilization already going on, or how they can integrate themselves into the larger campaign and help out. And that can look different ways, whether it's social media, whether it's just making phone calls, hosting screenings of the NRCAT video, breaking down the box. And right now we're working on a organizing toolkit where people can just log on to the website, they can download this toolkit, and they have step-by-step process in how they can organize and mobilize people right in their own community to help us with this campaign.
Absolutely. To speak to just a few of the tools that faith communities have been embracing and that we can make use of as people of faith. NRCAT was inspired by the work of advocates in Wisconsin who built a cell replica as part of their campaign, their statewide campaign to call for an end to the torture of prolonged solitary confinement. This is actually a photo of the cell replica that was brought to the steps of their state capitol last year. And inspired by their courageous action, NRCAT worked with a team here in Washington, D.C. To construct a solitary confinement replica that's on nationwide tour to interfaith and religious events around the country. St. Stephen and the Incarnation Episcopal Church actually welcomed us into their sanctuary and invited us to build the solitary replica in their sanctuary during Lent so that they would have a symbol of the tomb, of our modern day tombs, solitary cells there in their worship space. When people spend time in the replica, they're invited to spend between 5 minutes up to an hour. The experience includes audio recording from a maximum security prison in Maine, and individuals who spend even a few minutes inside walk out saying, they often ask questions like, in what country is this sort of practice allowed? Just sort of a shock that this is something that is happening day in and day out to literally thousands of our sisters and brothers. As Johnny said, as you said, right down the road from us. This isn't happening in some far off place. It's hidden, but it's hidden right under our noses.
Yeah.
So there are many opportunities, as Johnny mentioned, for us to plug in, and one that we want to invite you to consider how your congregation might be a part of this. Inspired by activists and organizers in California, including persons who are currently incarcerated in California, people of faith and people of conscience have been taking action on the 23rd of each month to continue to draw attention to the 23 hours a day that individuals spend in solitary confinement. This can be really simple. You can start out as simple as look at your calendar and on the 23rd of the month, host a vigil. Invite a local reporter to come and hear. Host a vigil where you say a prayer for those who are in solitary confinement. Share the story of someone from an organization like Solitary Watch. SolitaryWatch.org is an organization that shares the stories and writings of individuals currently enduring solitary. There are students who have been hosting chalk-ins where they'll simply draw a 6x9 cell in chalk on the street or on their campus and take turns sitting in that box for 23 hours on the 23rd, again, to keep and make visible the torture that has been so hidden within our communities. When you take action, if you go together to endsolitary.org, we want to know about your events, and this is something very easy to do. You can upload photos about past or upcoming events. You can use this space as a way to publicize something that you've got coming up. Check out the website and look back to October, September, see what others have done, and see how it might inspire you. Johnny, I wonder if you want to share a bit about the amazing stuff that's been happening in New York around the 23rd.
Yeah, so and it's important to note too that although some people do have the capacity to hold large events, in large public spaces, that the viewers should also feel comfortable doing events which are just direct proportion with whatever their capacity is. So I've seen events where people just get together in the living room and they might start a letter writing campaign and start writing people in solitary. You know. Um, or just sharing it with someone that they don't know that doesn't know about this.
Mhm.
So recently on the 23rd of last month, we went in front of the governor's mansion, and we held the vigil right in front of his mansion. We invited some reporters. We did get some media coverage in Albany. Um, and again, it was just increasing awareness about it, educating the public, and people walked by and they wanted to know more about it. And the small group turned into a larger group because people become concerned once they know about it. And we involve the voice of the people that are directly affected and encourage them to share their experiences with Terry, and to kind of humanize the issue. Anytime you have someone with experience talking about the issue, it humanizes it because sometimes we get so desensitized by numbers. Although we can't ignore numbers, you can't ignore 80,000 people right now as we do this webinar right now, sitting inside their cells at 8:45. They're probably getting ready to go to sleep. The last meal was at 5 o'clock. So there are real people behind these numbers. And these collective efforts on the 23rd of every month, the synergy that comes from it, is astounding. We can do together what we can't do apart or individually. And the energy that comes from it raises awareness and it really mobilizes people to make change on a whole nother level, stronger than any single one individual congregation can. But that doesn't mean that it starts with one person, but it doesn't end with one person,
Absolutely. So as Johnny had mentioned before, another resource that we have available is a film that was released this past summer called Breaking Down the Box. This is a 40-minute documentary. It's free. You can live stream it from NRCAT.org at the web address there on the screen. We will also mail free DVD copies. If you'd like a DVD copy, simply contact NRCAT. All we need is a commitment that you will watch it and you will share it. And we want to make sure that those DVDs are available to you. So look at your calendar, see an upcoming 23rd of the month when you might screen this film and connect and invite someone who has direct experience with this experience of solitary confinement to come and speak and be a part of it. Johnny actually stars in the film, so you can hear more from him in it, but there are a number of very powerful stories within the film, as well as inspiring stories of how communities of faith are stepping up to be a part of this movement. So we hope that you will make use of this resource and this tool.
And the film is very powerful in a lot of different senses, which it not only educates people, but it also, it gives people things that they can do, So, for example, it talks about the legislation, talks about the whole, it has a number of other websites people can log on, and, not only the NRCAT website, where people can actually use this information to mobilize.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I wanted to mention earlier, one of the things that I met one group of students who their time was limited, but they vowed that on the every month, they would share on social media things, simple facts about Salvo on their web pages. And as we know, some of us on Facebook and on Instagram and Twitter, we have thousands of followers. So one tweet or one share or one person's story on social media has the potential to reach thousands of people, which only takes about 1 or 2 minutes to kind of to type into your phone. So there's many different ways in which people can get involved and host a screening right in your own congregation or even in your living room. If it's summertime, you can do it right in your backyard. there's different ways. As your limitations are only limited by your imagination and creativity.
Mhm. Absolutely. So I know we wanted to have an opportunity for some conversation,
Yeah.
and just want to say again that this is something that, as people of faith, we are obligated to engage. As followers of Christ, who himself told us that what we do to those in prison, we do to him. And when we visit those in prison, we are literally encountering him. So our call is clear, and we are just excited to join with you as we look at what a faithful response to all of this is.
Thank you so much, both Laura and Johnny, for such a powerful presentation and a host of resources that we can tap into from now on as we continue to educate ourselves and others on these particular issues and how we might get involved. Dean, I want to invite you at this time. I know there are a few questions posed for Laura and Johnny, if you want to lead us in those.
Thank you, Monica. I do have a couple of questions that I'd like you all to consider. And these questions arose from my talking with some lay folks and other people who had some concerns about this particular issue. But I also want to thank you all for really a very inspiring but encouraging presentation. You gave us a great sense of hope uh, in a situation that often seems rather hopeless for many. And you're beginning to and continuing to give voice to the voiceless. And I so appreciate that. And that it sends a powerful message in and of itself. And you provided us with some great resources and some examples of action steps that can be taken. And I'm hopeful that our congregations and our uh, community members will not only take some time to study this issue, but also to move beyond study and make a difference in their communities and in their jurisdictions. But one of the questions that I had, and either one of you may want to respond or both, I mean, how do you respond to those, particularly those who work in corrections, who contend that solitary confinement or administrative segregation is necessary to protect people who may be at risk in the general population?
So I'll just start briefly and say that NRCAT began its engagement with this issue in the state of Maine, working with the Maine Council of Churches and other religious partners there who were a part of a broad community of leaders who worked to call for the Maine Department of Corrections to address its use of solitary confinement. And what they saw there was they worked directly with Commissioner Pont, who had recently been appointed there, who's now actually moved to New York City and to the Rikers Island jail complex. But in Maine, there was a roughly 70% reduction in the numbers of people that were being placed in solitary confinement. And what we heard from corrections officials on down was that assaults on staff went down as people were moved out of isolation. Those numbers go down because essentially when you're placing someone in the box, you're just delaying addressing the root cause of behavior. So if someone is acting out, if rather than simply literally locking them up and throwing away the key, which will only exacerbate whatever is causing that behavior, instead what we're saying is to address through a therapeutic intervention the root cause of that behavior. That's going to lead to actually increase safety for everyone involved, including the staff who are working in these facilities.
Laura, I saw a PBS Frontline documentary. I think it came out of the state of Maine that showed some of the frustrations of the warden and others who were in places of authority there, who became proponents for for limiting the use of solitary confinement. That's another great resource, I think.
It's an excellent resource. It's a devastating look at the reality of life on the inside of maximum security prison. In state departments of correction like Colorado, Washington State, and New Mexico, the heads of those state departments of correction have themselves been very outspoken about needing to confront the use of solitary confinement. Rick Ramish, the head of the Colorado Department of Correction, spent 23, well, his goal was to spend 23 hours. He spent about 20 hours in an isolation unit and then wrote a powerful op-ed that appeared in the New York Times saying essentially he knew that his mind would have quickly slipped. He had promised himself that he would live without his watch for the full 23 hours, and he finally broke down and said to the staff, "You've got to give me my watch. I've just got to know what time it is."
I wanted to add that, just the logic itself, if someone gets into a fight and then they're placed in solitary, they're not receiving any kind of anger treatment while they're there. And what happens is that people, once they're released, they have actually an increased amount of anger. And sometimes this anger is not only self-directed, which people tend to harm themselves, but it's also directed externally to officers, any kind of authority figures, and other people that are also in prison. This includes any type of drug rehabilitation programs. If people are placed in solitary for drug use, they're not receiving any kind of drug rehabilitation, while they're there. And one of the things that makes the HALT Act such a viable piece of legislation that will actually remedy this is that it allows for 6 hours of program time out of cell in addition to the 1 hour recreation. So it's saying yes, are there going to be people who sometimes can't play well with others? Absolutely. But does that mean that we need to isolate them? No, it just means that we need to separate them. And by giving them the proper treatment, medical care, et cetera, that they need, we can address the underlying issues that I'm mentioning. And we can attack the problem and not the symptoms of the problem.
Monica, do we have time for one more question?
I think we have time for one more. That'd be great.
This maybe seems like a simplistic question, but a lot of people who have never been inside a prison have misconceptions, and a lot of those misconceptions are based on the media and what the media portrays. So when somebody's in solitary confinement, do they have access to television or books or writing materials? How solitary is this solitary confinement?
It's very solitary. It's so I spent 3 years in solitary, with the longest stint at one time being 10 months. And there is no use of phone, there is no way to keep time. You will not be listening to the radio. You'll receive mail if somebody sends you mail. You have limited amount of reading material. You have access to 2 books per week. And I'm speaking specifically to New York City. You only have access to 2 books per week, and sometimes the library card doesn't even come around. You're allowed a small pen, and that pen runs out of ink after approximately about 3 or 4 pages of writing. And you can imagine there's a large amount of writing done in solitary, because if you're not reading, you're writing, you do need some kind of mental stimulation. I'll tell you that the first meal of the day is at 7 in the morning, and the last meal of the day is at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So it's routinely for people to go, 10, 11, 12 hours without a meal. And then if you're caught with food inside of your cell, that can lead to another misbehavior report, which in turn can lead to more solitary time. There is absolutely no educational programs. The medical care comes to your cell, but there is a huge break of confidence as he's being escorted by a correction officer. And sometimes you don't want to expose your medical situation to a doctor right in front of the correction officer, because he or she can then later on use that against you and share that information publicly with other prisoners, who can in turn use that to extort you or victimize you or place you in danger. There is absolutely no human contact unless you have a visit. And to add on to that, a lot of times in my experience, a lot of the correction officers really don't want to engage you while you're inside the cell. They don't want to tell you what time it is. They don't want to tell you what's the next meal. They don't want to even say hi, how you doing, or anything like that. There's been numerous times where I try to engage correction officers in conversation, and they won't even look at me in my face. So, and that does something to you. Sometimes we need that validation saying, hey, I'm here, I'm alive, And I've experienced that as an adult, you know, and also as a now responsibility.
Think.
So imagine who's trying to is and has a 60-year-old.
I think we're having a little bit of technical challenges with Johnny. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
There you go. Okay.
Okay. Wow. Sorry.
That's all right. I want to really, really thank you all for some really powerful, powerful information, and also the opportunity to make the reality about solitary confinement real to us. Johnny, your stories, the stories of Wata and Marie, and others who really bring the message home about what is happening in our prisons, to who our community members have been and hopefully will one day re-enter and be community members, and the challenges that they face. So thank you again. This ends our Q&A portion and our presentation for this webinar. We ask that you would please consider the many ways you and your congregation and community might get involved or further your ministries to address prison and jail issues, and in this case in particular around solitary confinement. Both the PowerPoint from tonight's webinar and the recording of the entire presentation will be available on the NBA website soon for your convenience. And we ask that you would please share these resources with others. A special thank you to the Reverend Laura Merkel Downton and Mr. Johnny Perez for your time and for such an outstanding presentation. We really appreciate it. And a word of thank you to our co-sponsors, Disciples Center for Public Witness, Disciples Justice Action Network, and Reconciliation Ministries. To get connected to NBA Prison and Jail Ministries, we invite you to email us at prisonministries@nbacares.org. We also would like you to remember to like NBA on Facebook. Request to join our NBA Prison and Jail Ministries Facebook group. Visit our NBA webpage for more information related to Disciples Health and Social Service Ministries, and look out for more upcoming information on all of our upcoming events. We also invite you to check out the NRCAT website, NRCAT.org as well, and learn more information and how you might get involved. Thank you so much for your time and patience with us, and we wish you a great night.
Thank you.